Thank you again and welcome everyone. This is the CMS Applications Policy Speaker Series. First of all, for the people in the phone and the people here, I would like to make the announcement. I think you received an email that the CMS Science Team meeting and the workshop that was scheduled for November that was canceled. So we will be sending more information as we receive updates from headquarters. So today we have Charlotte Streck. She is coming from Germany, and she's the co-founder and the director for Climate Focus, which is a nonprofit organization. And also Stephanie Rowe. She's a senior land use consultant for the organization. And they are going to be talking about progress, evaluating the international climate policies and land use assessments of the Paris Agreement and the New York Declaration of Forests. We're going to leave the questions for after the presentation. So without further ado, I leave you with Charlotte.
Thank you. And thanks for the invitation. I will quickly introduce Climate Focus and give you an idea what we're doing, also introducing ourselves, Stephanie and I. Thank you. Maybe you can help with that. And then I will pass on the microphone for Stephanie to give a first overview of some of the projects, and then I will come in and give a brief summary of a couple of other projects. So Climate Focus is a consultancy company, so it's not a non-for-profit. We are somewhere a consultancy think tank. We work at the connection between science and policy, so we do a lot of strategic advice in and around climate change. We have offices in Washington, D.C., in Berlin, in Amsterdam, and in Bogota. Our offices in D.C. and in Berlin, which I had, focus on land use. So what we do a lot of work on deforestation and on sustainable agriculture and supply chains, agricultural supply chains, and the Amsterdam office focuses on renewable energies and clean tech solutions. Our clients are do you know how it works? Our clients are mostly public sector and NGOs and philanthropy with an occasional private sector client. But mostly we work for the U.S. government. We have worked with the State Department, with USAID. We work with the German government. We have worked for the UK government, but also with governments in developing countries, mostly in rainforest countries. So we have worked with Chile, with Colombia, with Peru, among others. On philanthropies, we do a lot of strategic advice with big U.S. foundations. So you will see quite a few of the projects that we present today are actually where the clients are foundations. And then we do work with large NGOs. So we have worked here in the U.S. with TNC, or Conservation International, or WWF. We have a very multidisciplinary team. We are about 30 people, all disciplines. So I'm a lawyer and a biologist, but we have agronomists, we have economists, we have political scientists. So we have a bit of everything. As long as the people are good analysts and have certain international credentials, for us it's important that people have worked or are reasonably familiar with working in developing countries, that they can travel and that they are culturally adaptable. Then we take essentially whatever the career is. When we focus in the selection of the projects that we want to present here on those that are at the interface between data and policy making, because we felt that that may be the most interesting and the most relevant for this group here. We give a broad overview. We start with a project that is very global and looks at 1.5 degree climate scenarios, and then we go further down through, looking at the Paris Agreement and forest goals, the New York Declaration. Then we go, I will discuss a bit the supply chain work that we do and give an example for what we do on the cocoa sector. I think that, without further, introduction, I will pass on to Stephanie, who will present the first two projects, and then I will see you in 10 minutes again. So I give you here, you need to take this. Put it in your pocket.
Okay. I will start with the project, which is Contribution of the Land Sector to a 1.5 degree world. As you guys know, in Paris, the parties came together to set a global target of well below 2 degrees, and also, to the surprise of everyone, encouraged everyone to aim for 1.5 degrees. In addition, parties also committed to reach a global peaking of greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible, and then also to achieve a balance between sources and sinks by the second half of the century. So this, at least the 1.5 degree component came as a big surprise to a lot of people, namely scientists who hadn't even done a lot of those simulations. And so I guess a lot of scientists came together and tried to figure out, okay, well, what does this scenario look like? And specifically considering the NDCs that were submitted after Paris were quite a bit, as you can see in the graph here, quite not ambitious enough to reach 2 degrees, let alone 1.5. And the land sector is usually relegated priority in favor of energy and industry. But to reach a global peaking, and especially to reduce emissions to net zero, to have that balance, we're really going to rely a lot on the land sector. So the CIF, which is the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, contracted us to develop a roadmap for the land sector, specifically for philanthropy and practitioners as well as policymakers, to answer the following questions, which is the first, what's required of the land sector to be able to meet 1.5 degrees? What portfolio of strategies and technologies exist in the land sector? And what's their mitigation potential and economic and political feasibility to be able to contribute to that 1.5 degree target? And also, what interventions should be prioritized, and when and where should they be deployed? So essentially creating this roadmap moving forward. So just some highlight findings, since we're talking about 4 projects here, so I'm going to just talk about it pretty quickly, and we can come back to it during Q&A later on. But we first did a meta-analysis of 1.5 degree scenarios, which there weren't very many as of this summer. There was a handful, as you can see in this graph. And the main takeaways of this is that both 1.5 degree and 2 degree require a peak and decline of about 2020, with net negative emissions occurring between 2040 and 2070 for 1.5 degree and 2 degree respectively. Also, they require a similar type of transformation of the energy, industry, and land sector, and both require negative emissions of some kind. The main difference between 1.5 degree and 2 degrees really is that 1.5 degrees requires much earlier and much more aggressive action. So 1.5 degrees is about 10 to 25 years in terms of reductions compared to 2 degrees. Also, 1.5 degrees rely about 10 to 50% more on carbon removal from negative emissions technologies compared to the 2C scenario. And then also for the 1.5 degrees, after 2030, there are much fewer pathways. So it's kind of the amount of emissions that we reduce in the next decade really is going to play a major role in terms of how many pathways we have after that. So to dive in a little bit deeper on the land sector, we worked with our partners at IASA and modeled 1.5 degrees for the land sector using RCP 1.9, which is kind of the new 1.5 degree specific representative concentration pathway. And the finding here is that with LULUCF, which is land use change, you can see that in both the 2 degree and the 1.5 degree scenario, they require basically dramatic downshift. So that comes a lot from reduced deforestation and increased afforestation. And then for agriculture, you'll see that both of them begin to decline at around 2030 with much faster and deeper emissions reductions in the 1.5 degree scenario. So we're basically giving agriculture the opportunity to increase a little bit due to increasing demand as well as increasing population growth, and then decreasing thereafter, mostly related to enteric fermentation and reduction in methane from rice fields. We are putting together a manuscript and a paper right now, and we're going to be digging in a lot more detail on the very specific activities within each of these, both agriculture and land sector, and that should be submitted very shortly. And then the other part that we did is we looked at, we did a bottom-up synthesis of literature looking at mitigation activities, which is essentially an update from the IPCC AR5 report in 2014. And we updated a lot of these numbers based on newer literature that has come out in the last few years. And we find that there is enough mitigation on the supply side. You can see here from this table that the supply side and the demand side are separated, and they are not additive in this case. So the supply side is kind of what we think about on reducing emissions from agriculture and from reducing deforestation. And demand side has a large potential as well, but it wouldn't be additive to the supply side. So we can reach about 24, I believe it's 24 gigatons on the supply side total. That's the highest end of the spectrum, and then about 9.5 on the lower side of the spectrum for supply side. And then demand side is about 2.85 on the lower side of the spectrum, up to about 10.7 on the higher side of the estimates. And then we did an exercise to look at, because there wasn't any mitigation potential that was disaggregated by country. And so what we did was we did a kind of quick assessment on how much mitigation potential there was overall, and then applied them to the emissions that are in each of the countries. And the main findings is that Brazil, Indonesia, China, India, US, the EU, and then subsequently Mexico, DRC, are kind of the top countries that have the highest mitigation potential. And then we did a economic feasibility assessment and a political feasibility assessment, which I'm not going to go into here because it's going to be a little bit too much info. We can talk about that in the Q&A, but essentially we put them in 3 buckets, which are the no regrets, so the developed countries, or not no regrets, no excuses, should I say, of the developed countries, meaning you guys don't have any excuses. You have, supposedly the funding and the governance in place to be able to, make this happen. All you need is a political will. And then you have kind of the middle upper income countries like Brazil and China that are increasing their political will and also increasing the amount of finance and the amount of governance that they have. And then you have kind of barrier countries that we need to figure out a way to help, which includes countries like Indonesia, India, and DRC. And to kind of conclude this section is that we developed a roadmap, which I'm not showing the full roadmap here. We're still working on finalizing that. But essentially, we identified 12 main activities, and we quantified the amount of emissions reduction within those activities by decade. And it kind of, the synthesis of it comes to this roadmap, which is a little bit different to the one that we modeled, specifically because we tried to reduce the amount of reliance on negative emissions technologies that are not yet developed, like BECS. And so we tried to increase the ambition on total cuts or reduction in emissions so that we didn't have to rely so much on negative emissions technologies. So this is going to be ready by COP, and then that leads me to the next one, which is a project that we've been running since 2015, which is the New York Declaration on Forests, where we essentially lead a project and a group of partners on evaluating the progress on the New York Declaration on Forests. So what is the NYDF? Essentially, it's a voluntary, non-binding international declaration that was endorsed at the Climate Summit in 2014. And it was endorsed at that time by about 150 governments and organizations. And now, in 2016, last year, it had about 190 endorsers. It sets out 10 goals, which essentially range from very technical, we're going to reduce we're going to reduce the rate of forest loss by half by 2020 and strive to end natural forest loss by 2030, which is a very ambitious target. It also looks at supply chain, improving the supply chains in agricultural commodities, and then also restoring 150 million hectares of degraded land by 2020 and then 200 million by 2030, as well as other goals related to financing, governance, and policy. So as I mentioned before, we lead this consortium of the New York Declaration of Forest Assessment, and we have a lot of partners, mostly who are topical experts in various fields. And so we have, this is actually a little bit outdated, we have WRI, TNC, Chatham House, and a few others included that are not here pictured. But essentially, our partners are a range of either topical experts, or they provide data, or they do outreach to relevant stakeholders like practitioners and policymakers. And I wanted to just quickly, so we do these annual reports, and they're due at about October every year, and so we're actually working on the one in 2017 now. So I wanted to just quickly give you guys a quick overview of the findings that we had from last year's report. So for goal 1, gross and net forest loss relative to 2020, you can see that we kind of look at 2 indicators. The first one is gross tree cover loss, which we use the Global Forest Watch and the Hansen data set, which they use the Landsat data. And there is basically no progress there. You could see the dotted yellow line is the 5-year moving average, and it's not going down. However, when you look at net natural forest loss, which we use the FAO data set, it is going down. And so this is kind of an interesting conversation where you decide what indicator is it that you look at to determine, whether there's progress happening. But basically, we're seeing that probably afforestation, reforestation is outpacing forest loss at this point. And last year, we did a zoom in on goal 2, which is looking at how private sector affects, or how to help the private sector reduce emissions through supply chains. And so we looked at a few categories, primarily looking at how many companies are increasing their commitment to reducing deforestation, which we see that there is quite a significant amount of companies that are doing that. However, a lot of them are concentrated in palm oil and timber and pulp, and there's very few in the soy and cattle, which right now is experiencing a boom in South America. And then also with the implementation is a lot of them have policies in place. However, the monitoring, actually, very few of them can trace back to the production level. It's going to be quite difficult for them to be able to implement a lot of those policies. And then currently, we don't have data to be able to monitor actual impact on deforestation. So are those improvements and commitments that the private sector is making, are those actually translating to reduce deforestation on the ground? And we currently don't have data right now to be able to monitor that. However, our partners at SEI are currently developing a platform called Trace to be able to answer that question, hopefully in the future. And then lastly, our goal 5, which is the restoration goal. We see that there is significant progress being made. We use the data from the bond challenge, and then also the INDC submitted to to the UNFCCC. And we do see that there's significant progress. However, similar to Goal 2, these are all commitments. They're not what's happening on the ground. And so this is another major data gap in terms of how do we measure the amount of restoration that's actually happening on the ground, which we can't do right now. So right now we rely on data that's just looking at commitments. And I guess I'll just wrap that up, and Charlotte can take over. But I just wanted to say that both of those projects, we then link to policy at the end, because we do a lot of outreach after these products are completed, and we do a lot of those, that outreach at the COP.
Yeah, more specifically on this first project, which Stephanie presented on for CIF, for the Children Investment Fund Foundation, which is a big UK foundation, and that is we will develop an academic publication out of what we did, but also various policy papers, and present it at international meetings as well as different donor roundtables. So that's already scheduled, and that is an important part of all our work, in the part that we do these analyses, and then we identify, need for finance, need for political action, need for data. So, and then we hope that we can point the different groups. So we tailor our messages to the different groups and go and say, this is what needed. This is where we need to invest into more monitoring capacity. This is where political action is needed, or this is where finance is needed. It's also, in that sense, it is also symptomatic that the New York Declaration is a multi-stakeholder effort. It's already a declaration of government and private sector, indigenous people organizations and NGOs to say we need to do something, and we help a bit on holding that group accountable, but then also developing concrete solutions or recommendations on what could be done. And we also realize there is always, when you work at the interface between politics or political, with politicians on one hand and with implementers on the other hand, politicians tend to be vague. These different, whether you look at the Paris Agreement or you look at the New York Declaration on Forests, or whether you need the national commitments under the Paris contribution, under the Paris Agreement of the government, sometimes, you get the impression that there was deliberately vague so that it could not be, monitored so much. So we work a lot on trying to develop frameworks and assessment framework and indicators to say, okay, within this, within that vague formulation, this is what we think we can monitor. That brings me to the next one. The Tropical Forest Alliance 2020 is yet another one of these public-private initiatives. Set up based pretty much on a U.S. initiative. It has about 100 members by now, also private sector, public sector, and governments. The lead governments that have pushed for it and set it up were the UK, the US, and Norway. Norway is with us a lot because Norway, in the whole climate change arena, have essentially decided to push for reduced emissions from deforestation. This is where all the, not all, but most of the efforts go. So they are present in that field, but also the UK, the US, at least until recently, and Germany. So these are from the developing country nations, those that are big supporters of this work. So the Tropical Forest Alliance 2020 focuses on Goal 2 of the New York Declaration, which is eliminating deforestation from major agricultural supply chains with a focus on palm oil, soy, beef, and pulp and paper. So it is essentially a spin-off group which looks for solutions there. And we took here that what we do, which is a document that is here, these are the proofs that I have to read this afternoon. before they go to the printer, because they will be this document will be released at Climate Week at the UN in 2 weeks from now. And it's the Commodities and Forest Agenda 2020, essentially taking our findings from the New York Declaration Progress Assessment and saying, okay, we know there is political will and there are commitments, but so far they do not translate into results. So what do we need to do as international community, and what are the things that we need to prioritize to eliminate, to achieve these goals? We are aware that these 2020 goals are aspirational and increasingly so, but they still give a bit of urgency in here and saying, okay, of the many things that we can do, what is it what we have to prioritize? So this is, an agenda which lists 10 priorities, starting from eliminating or including eliminating illegality from supply chains. It's very important. It will not save the forest. Legality alone will not save the forest, but eliminating illegality is a very important first step. That's also, again, where data and transparency is increasing transparency is also one of the goals. It's very important because we see that governments need data and need to know what's going on, also to be able to effectively enforce their laws. We have a goal related to palm oil certification, so sustainable supply chains in the sense that you certify at the producer level. Then working with jurisdictions, so meaning either governments, national governments, or subnational governments on integrated planning approaches. So what we call the jurisdictional approaches is where you bring supply chain commitments from the private sector together with governments, improved governance efforts from the public sector, and a larger scale monitoring again, so that you don't look at the individual plantation, but essentially you look at a much broader scale to avoid also that there is displacement and leakage. So then we have something on sustainable soil production, increasing productivity of smallholder yields, very important for palm oil, but also for cocoa. Then addressing land tenure. That's another thing where land tenure and titling. Another thing where transparency, data, and information is key. The majority of the countries of this world have very unsecure land titling systems. There is no registration, and that makes it difficult to invest in these landscapes because there is no title security. It also leads to conflict. So we looked in this context at the overlapping of agricultural concession and community claimed land, which again is creating a lot of conflict. We also look at indigenous peoples' land, which is traditionally associated with higher degrees of protection. And finance, so you see, I'm very much into this now, so I can go on, and so I need to, because I have to. This is really fresh, very fresh from press this morning. Here, just an example for two of the goals. There, we look at we try our start for when we develop these 10 priorities of saying. So first, the materiality. So if we do something, is it actually associated with deforestation and so reduced deforestation? Is it important? And then the second test was, is it feasible? So is already something going on where we know what to do? The solutions are there. We just need to scale them, accelerate them, finance them. So here we look, for example, at the jurisdictions, so countries or states that are already engaged in or have publicly committed to sustainable supply chains, where we say, okay, we have a momentum there, and that's something that is investable and can be supported. Or here at the other side, we look at legality and problems related to lack and enforcement. Brazil is an interesting case because it is at the moment a good case for what law enforcement can do, but it's also a case where it's saying at the moment it goes back a bit, it slides back because of governance and, government challenges also. But in the past it has been very successful by using real-time data and enabling enforcement authorities to effectively protect the forest. So that's this number of 5 million hectares that have been protected between 2007 and 2010 due to a real-time monitoring system. And then finally, when it goes, so this is still, relatively high-level communication piece. So we also then take it yet a step further down. So we are currently working with the World Bank on a piece of advice for West Africa and the cocoa sector. In Africa, cocoa, in West Africa, in particular in Ghana and in Cote d'Ivoire, but also in Cameroon, cocoa is a very important driver of deforestation. It is linked to smallholders, and the inability, smallholders often don't have the ability to increase production on their small plots, and then they drive, deforestation. There's very little forest left anyway, and there is an overall problem in cocoa where you have an aging, it's 90% smallholders, it's mostly old people and old trees. And that leads to a lack of investment and also to declining productivity, and the productivity goes down, and even less and less younger people want to go into the sector. At the same time, 90% of the world cocoa supply comes from West Africa, and it is absolutely essential for these countries also to get foreign currency. It's the most important sector of the economy, and there we did an analysis on the current state, also what cocoa companies can do. Interesting for the cocoa sector is also that other than palm oil, for example, it's very integrated. There are about 8 big. All these sectors are very interesting, and they're very different, and hence also the solution are very different. In cacao, it is 90% smallholder produced, but then you have a very integrated supply chain as the processor, where you have 8 companies dominating the cacao market for the world with 80%. And they are concerned about the situation, with also concerned about the older people and the older trees, because they are concerned about stability and quality of supply, and are increasingly also looking at, programs or supporting smallholders in the aggregation, and it's a combination of investment and technical assistance to support a reform of these plantations. And this piece of work, where we look at first what are the barriers, and then we have a follow-up assignment now that goes and I'm too stupid for this. So one more. Oh, okay, we are already here. Where we look at financial models, where we have on one hand the World Bank and IFC as partners, and the World Cocoa Foundation, which is the industry association of the different cocoa producers, and looking at potentially setting up a fund or a technical assistance facility that helps in increasing productivity and livelihoods for smallholder farmers in West Africa. Good. So this is our last slide, and then we are happy to discuss this. So for us, as you see, it is very important across all what we are doing, this question, transparency also of the public good. The more one knows and the more is being shared and made public, the better solution can be formed, and it also enables civil society to hold other actors accountable. But also traceability. Traceability is important, in particular with the supply chain, that here the companies that take on commitments to reduce deforestation embedded in consumer goods, and be able to go through the supply chain and make sure that the producers are supported in switching towards more sustainable practices. So research needs, so that is, I think it's important to say that Stephanie is also currently working on a PhD in geoscience or biological science, or
biosphere atmosphere dynamics.
Yeah, so and has a pretty good idea on what the research needs are. So she focuses, among others, on restoration and afforestation, reforestation. We, as a team, work a lot on supply chain attribution of land use impact, and then a big whole that continues also to be soil carbon. In the different models that we work with on mitigation opportunity, soil carbon is always a big hole, a big not known because it's so controversial and not clear what the actual mitigation potential is. So we always either leave it out or with a big asterisk on it. With that, thank you for your attention, and we are here for your questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you, Stephanie. So we are going to open it for questions. The people online, you can write the question, or you can ask the question via phone, or if you have any questions here in the room. Or if you want to comment, also to show you had some comments that you wanted to make.
A different question or comment. To my knowledge, the Paris Agreement is a non-binding agreement. It's a voluntary, it's a voluntary effort by countries. There's no binding regulation there, right?
Well, no, the Paris Agreement as an agreement is binding. Okay. It also has binding parts, which are procedural. So it has, the binding part is that countries need to communicate their nationally determined contributions. They also need to update those, and there is also, transparency. There's a lot. This part, the procedural part, is binding, as is the overall agreement. What is not binding, and that's the big difference to the Kyoto Protocol, is the actual contributions of the countries. So the countries, there is no meta, rule which says the different countries need to mitigate X%, and they are complete, and a system as under the Kyoto Protocol that would then hold the countries accountable towards that target. Here in the Paris Agreement, we have it's in the discretion of the countries to formulate their nationally determined contribution. It is expected, but that is in vague language. Then the developed countries assume economy-wide targets, and the developed countries generally have communicated those. Emerging economies, and that includes Brazil and China and Colombia and Peru, so all middle-income countries, they normally have also economy-wide targets, but they are relative to a business as usual. So meaning that they come up with a projection of emissions growth and say, compared to this emission growth, we reduce. So that's different from the absolute targets of developed countries. And then you have the least developed countries and the poorest countries that do not formulate economy-wide targets, not relative, not absolute, but formulate measures. So they would say we expand renewable energy by X%, or we afforest so and so many hundreds, thousands of hectares, or be it what it may. That is the type. It is in the Paris Agreement. The idea is that the targets become increasingly more ambitious, which means that the middle-income countries are then expected to move towards absolute targets relatively soon. The middle-income countries generally do quite a lot on climate change, I must say. So I would not think that currently overall one could say that developing countries would invest less than developed countries in terms of political capital, or compared to what they have in their economic GDP, that they would invest less. So what was true for the Kyoto Protocol that one could say was for developed countries, and developing countries are not doing anything, that has definitely changed.
I have a question based on what Stephanie shared earlier, when you gave the examples of 2 cases where you were measuring based on commitments rather than on actuals, what are the actual data gaps? Meaning, what do you wish you could measure to get the actuals? I couldn't quite catch what your ideal.
Sorry, what? So when the first graph that I showed, where I showed the 1.5, 2 degrees, and then NDC.
No, it's the 2 cases that one was Bonn and the other was right before that one. I think it was the New York case. We were saying you'd like to be able to measure people have committed and they endorse these things, and then what we can measure is people committed. We can't measure the actual.
I see. Yeah. So with the restoration,
what data you had?
Yeah. Well, so with the restoration piece, we have had a lot of difficulty because we rely primarily on existing data sets. We don't develop our own data sets. And for the deforestation piece, we rely on Global Forest Watch, which is the Hansen data set with Landsat, and then the FAO piece. And then more recently, we're also including emissions using Vicini and the Zarin kind of approach, also using remotely sensed data. However, we've asked WRI if we could use the forest growth data to be able to be an indicator for reforestation restoration, and they're saying that it's the uncertainty is too high, and we also it's really difficult to measure whether or not growth by, even if you measure every 5 years, depending on where it is. If it's in the tropics, for example, where you have slow-growing trees, you might not be able to detect an area that you could count and say, yes, they are restoring there. And so I think what I meant by that is that right now, at least by the experts in the room that kind of shut us down when we wanted to include the Global Forest Watch tree growth data, they said absolutely not. That's just, we can't correlate that to restoration impact because the uncertainty is too high. So we would love it if some kind of data set emerged to where we would be able to then have kind of a global wall-to-wall assessment of restoration progress.
So it's massive data problem, actually.
Yeah.
Right? You can see a huge role for remote sensing. The other question I have is, assume you do get that, what is the acceptance rate, or not rate, I guess, but what is the acceptance of remote sensing by any random particular country as to the validity of that data set? Would you run into problems like that or not?
I don't think so. I mean, we certainly ran into problems with the tree growth piece, but I mean, I think the Global Forest Watch deforestation map has been widely accepted, okay. And I think that with a period, I believe Nancy actually gave a talk to this very, Nancy from Global Forest Watch, she manages that data set, but they've done a really good job in socializing that tool and the map, and actually less developed countries use it as a monitoring tool currently. And so I think that has large acceptance. And in terms of looking at, I know that there's products being developed now looking at being able to better detect degradation, for example. And I was told that those are kind of opening the doors potentially to better restoration, regeneration data sets in the future. That those kind of products could lead the way. So I think that once it gets developed, I certainly think that there would be wide acceptance of that, and certainly a lot of need and desire for the larger community, because currently we can only rely on what countries tell us and what the commitments are.
Okay, it's a national reporting system, right? So
right.
That may or may not be credible in all cases, right. Because they may not be able to measure it themselves or don't have a system. The other comment I have or a question is, going back to the cocoa example, is there not a conflict, I guess, but a pressure between economic development and sustainability and efforts to reduce deforestation and emissions?
Yeah.
Because if you improve production in cocoa, that could lead to a negative impact on emissions and deforestation and land use and all sorts of things, right?
Yeah, that is not only true for cocoa. It is the problem with sustainable intensification, which is we know we need to intensify, in particular with smallholders, and that is across the board, whether in developing country commodities, whether you look at palm oil or you look at cocoa or you look at small, cattle ranching. Not so much soy. Soy is essentially already, intensified across the landscape. But with the others, we know you need to increase the income and the yields to reduce the land. But then, does the land sparing lead to increased deforestation because you increase profitability on smaller plots and the income so that they can deforest quicker, or you can actually protect the landscape? That is a tricky issue, and that is, of course, that's where you come. This is where this jurisdictional, what we call the jurisdictional approaches are important, because it only works if the extension to the farmers and the increase in productivity is embedded into a program that protects the standing forest and the ecosystems that should be protected. So without that public sector component that does the enforcement, it could also be community monitoring, but there needs to be that component. Without that, it may actually, have not the conservation outcome, or even worse, it may drive even more deforestation. This is something which we are struggling with all across with agricultural commodities. On one hand, you need to have it more efficient. On the other hand, also, the more industrialized the agriculture is, the more destructive it becomes.
Sure.
And so this is at the core of where we need to be extremely careful, extremely site-specific, having a lot of checks and balances. The solution cannot be not to intensify smallholder production, but it needs to be done with a lot of care. But that is a core problem. Also, where we don't understand the rebound effects well enough, yet there's only patchy literature, case studies, but we don't have the rule that would apply across the commodities, or even in a particular country. Yeah.
We have a question. You can go ahead. We have a question online from Doug Myers. He says, from my perspective here in Chesapeake Bay, and from what you see at the global level, is addressing loss of forested buffers and mature forest protection here as important as signals we could send through the supply chain, such as imports of cocoa and palm oil from abroad? And I don't know if, Doug, I don't know if you are online and you want to address the question.
It's not an either or. So what we do, one thing is that the whole agenda of protecting forests and ecosystems is as important as, reducing the deforestation associated with the supply chain and our consumption. That is definitely not an either or. And as I said, all what we do on the supply chains need to go hand in hand with protection. And it's also not what we do abroad is not an either or with what needs to be done in the U.S. or in Europe. I'm absolutely, and that's what Stephanie mentioned. There are these non-excuse measures that we list also for the U.S. and Europe, and definitely they need to be done. It just happens that we, with our work, are mostly working with global players and global platforms. So we are not a group that focuses on the U.S. or Europe and domestic measures. But that is absolutely no judgment on what is more important or not.
So are you doing anything with land tenure issues, or you mentioned it in passing, but
yeah,
have you had any specific price on that, and where are you at?
Well, we look at land. Well, I'm a lawyer, so I do quite a lot of that analysis. But what we've done, we have worked with different countries and trying to identify the overlapping legal systems. But the next step, so that mostly analytical work. So we did in the context of integrated landscape planning, we did it in Ethiopia, We did it in Ghana a number of years ago. We do a lot at the moment post-conflict in Colombia, which is also a big planned 10-year mess and an explosive one. You know, whole peace process depends on sorting out the land issues in Colombia. We have done a bit of it in Peru, but mostly at the analytical level. What needs to happen then is the next one is the actual registration. Yeah.
A lot of the implementation requires a lot of political, administrative, social actions. And how does one monitor progress in those areas? What sort of indicators would you use to see how implementation is progressing in any random country? Policy-wise, we can make statements. What's happening on the ground?
Well, the problem is what we have, and Stephanie, you can say, what we have on one hand declarations.
Yes.
And then we have deforestation data. We know that we have an increasing number of declarations from all over, you know, public sector, private sector, you know, the big U.S. companies, the government, and we have data which says at the moment, actually, we are not making sufficient progress. What is hard for us to assess is to which extent there is change happening, because everything has a time lag. You know, we know that in particular in land use, much more so than in renewable energy, or in industry, because of land tenure and transparency and all these issues, it takes a long time. To which extent we are actually moving in the right direction, and whether these governance changes are happening and we are on right track, we don't know. Partly it's, you know, what we did for the Tropical Forest Alliance is saying, you know, we need to look at these 10 priorities and put a lot more effort and put a lot of more transparency in these areas and in these regions so that we understand it better and see whether we are in fact on the right track. Because we also have the problem that we go to conferences and we talk to people that are in our field. We always meet the same people. We are, you know, we live in our echo chamber and say this needs to be done and this needs to be done, and everybody agrees. But to which extent it really happens, and what, you know, where are the levers where we can still do better? It's always difficult. I don't know.
Time might be good to talk
Yeah.
about too.
Do you want? I'm talking a lot.
No, go ahead.
No, and there is, we do next year, so for this New York Declaration work, we do every year a deep dive in one area. So we do monitor across all 10 goals, and then we do one much more detailed report where we also commission not new data, but new analysis, at least, you know, fresh literature analysis and more work. And next year we will focus on goal 10 of the New York Declaration, which is about forest governance. And so there we have, next week we have a first planning meeting with different, you know, groups there in the US here, the Right and Resources Institute or the Chatham House in the UK, different others that work on illegality and governance indicators, and try to understand much better that complicated area. It is, yeah, complicated.
Another side comment. All these things are going to take a long time. What I'm curious is what actions are taken to introduce these concepts and philosophies perhaps in the education system at a very early age so that kids grow up thinking with a different perspective. So that's going to be what's going to affect the future social or educational or structural systems in countries. If that's not addressed, it might be more problematic to see a future in the evolution of implementation actions.
I absolutely agree, and that comes back to the echo chamber, right? So we need to bring the rest of the population up. But it's not, this is, personally I can say I raised money since 5 years for the Alliance for Climate Education here, which is a great group, but just because motivated by this concern, where it's like, we are not necessarily reaching all the people. And in Colombia, where a country where we do a lot, we also run a big project now, which is reaching out to arts and engagement, reaching out to young people in post-conflict areas where the resource pressures and the human development pressures are very high, to bring these people, have a help to create a positive narrative for these young people. But that we can't measure. We can do our best efforts with all what we can do, but I agree that this is absolutely essential.
Doug Myers, in the questions, he was saying good clarification, thanks, and his organization is trying to figure out how we can contribute to climate goals that fit well with our water quality charge. His organization is the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and he says that we will certainly be addressing forest loss throughout the watershed. We should contribute to this goal.
Yeah.
We also have lots of dealings with the Port of Baltimore, which already has cocoa imports and is planning a major palm oil processing facility. While this approach is outside our organization chart, we could take advantage of our partnership with the port to advance the international part of the agenda.
And that's very interesting, and congratulations to your group. This is a great NGO. So I know people that work there, so that's fantastic what they do. And we do not with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, but we do work with our Dutch office also with the Port of Rotterdam, which is yet another enormous port, and also has several palm oil refinery facilities already. And we are trying to do this there. So very, very happy to, Doug?
Yes.
Yeah, also to reach out to us to discuss that. And congratulations.
What are they doing actually?
So I'm not sure whether, can you read it again? I feel I'm not entitled to
explain. So they are addressing forest loss throughout the watershed of the Chesapeake Bay.
Yeah.
And then they have a lot of dealings with the Port of Baltimore, and they already have the Port of Baltimore. They have cocoa imports, and they're planning a major palm oil processing facility.
So how does that help the palm oil processing facility? What's the connection is what I'm trying to see between that and any?
I think they want to kind of like help in the international agenda of climate focus.
No, and there is, Doug, maybe, sorry if I'm again not getting it right, so then we talk offline afterwards. No, there is, so it's groups that do work on local water quality. They also work on watersheds, which has a forest component. And if you engage local players, if you work with municipalities, then the question always comes up, what can be done, for example, to get the Port of Rotterdam climate neutral, which is where we're working. And then one question is always, what is what we are getting in here? If the palm oil that we refine is full of deforestation, then, we are part of that dirty supply chain, and then we need to work on this. So that's the type of work that we are doing.
For example, a lot of the pollution in China, we in the U.S. own.
Yeah.
Because all the manufacturing is done there.
Yeah.
So I presume here.
Okay, their pollution then comes over here, so it comes back to us.
Yeah. Full circle.
Right. We get what we...
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a few questions about. He added for Sushil, also the Port of Baltimore wants to be a green port. So sending signals back through the supply chain could be a good way to change things in West Africa.
All right.
Yeah.
So that's the
Yeah.
driving factor there. Okay.
I think that's a common thing. You're talking about the ability to measure afforestation or forest degradation, and some of our teams here are looking, because it's true that like the pure imagery data, like they just have lands that it's not necessarily enough detail, but some of the teams are looking at using radar, and one of the teams that I worked with is basically not always free data is the point. So they may have to get an agreement with a group, and they can get access to commercially provided data, but they can, for example, just even if we were looking at, we were thinking about wetlands, and specifically with those that are mangrove-driven, they are actually forest wetlands, and ones that where you can, they can see a signal of both actual, like, total increase, but also areas that, haven't increased in area, but have increased in quality, because they're measuring height. And they do have ideas about it. It's kind of the emerging capability, but it's not data that's necessarily freely to everybody. So we are...
Is it global?
No, it's not. Right now, it's like, we pick a country, we do that country in detail.
Yeah.
It's not like it's ready to go, but just that...
Yeah, no, that's great.
Progress, at least having a
Yeah, definitely.
Anyway, but we can talk about
Yeah,
that.
great.
And going into that, what are you doing any work in the U.S.? You were mentioning subnational, that you're engaged with subnational entities. Those are like states outside the U.S., I mean?
Well, it's
Yeah.
mostly because our work is mostly focusing on developing and the rainforest protection or in these countries. We work with U.S. players, but also to the extent that they engage abroad. The only thing as climate focus that we did for a jurisdiction a while ago, we worked on to quantifying emission reduction from weatherization programs of the state of Maine. That was where we did look at reduction of emissions through a public program in the U.S. But that's, a while ago, but that we did.
So looking for data, then it would be more helpful global data. Than
Yeah, generally. I mean, we certainly work at a national level within the tropical countries, and we certainly also work at a jurisdictional level in those countries as well. So, for example, Orinoquia in Colombia, or Mato Grosso. So we do work at a jurisdictional level, and certainly data, but usually we work with governments, and so they provide the data.
Or not.
Or actually, or not. But I think data on that level is also helpful. But I think global is good, because then we work a lot on prioritization of strategies, and I think that's one of the main things that's good to have when you have global data, is you can kind of see where it needs to be deployed. And then from there, you can kind of prioritize based on feasibility, who's ready to actually deploy those activities. And then that's kind of where we would work. But we need kind of that larger level first to be able to do the prioritization.
And in that sense, CMS is they're providing data to organizations like Global Forest Watch.
Right.
So for example, Richard Hoffman, he provided this map for the tropical regions of America, Africa, and Asia of deforested area biomass that I think Global Forest Watch incorporated into the tool. So that's maybe kind of like a way that stakeholders like you are receiving the data instead of like directly through NASA.
Right.
Is from NASA, from the PI to an organization, and then use that data from WRS.
Right. Yeah, we tend to rely on already analyzed data, mostly related to timelines of projects and things like that. Yeah. Right, exactly. Capacity and timing and projects, exactly. Yeah.
So the million-dollar question, do you see any impact on all these climate activities on the President's administration? Yes?
On what? I'm sorry.
On the administration, the U.S. administration? Oh.
Well, maybe I shouldn't be asking this question. It's a free country, right?
Yeah, and I don't know. So what we see at the moment is that the projects that we have worked on and with, whether it's USAID or others, are all insecure.
Right.
That's what we see. There is not yet, necessarily a decision. We see an enormous insecurity. The good news is, and that is, I'm old enough to have seen the second pulling out of the U.S. of an international climate agreement. And the first one, which was, of course, the Kyoto Protocol, was much more shocking for the rest of the world. Because then the Kyoto Protocol depended on the EU and the US in particular to support this agreement and take emission reductions. And it was a big blow. And it was a flawed agreement to start with a lot of problems, but it never recovered. And today we are in a different world. I feel, and then I must say, I feel the rest of the world by now is moving ahead and developing clean energies and clean technologies and getting states subsidized to do this. So I feel a bit, the U.S. could play a big role also in terms of technology, and it is unfortunate if it doesn't. But there will other players that will move ahead.
If the disincentive for, I mean, private sector that would be at a loss if they don't participate in the renewable energy industry.
Yeah, definitely.
Right.
I also see that as a German national. We have a big problem, as you all know, with our auto industry, which is not up to, it's not producing the cars of the future at all. And politically, it's not receiving the pressure. And I'm pretty sure that in emerging economies, whether China or India, within the next, but a short 10 years, they will take decisions to, phase out fuel-based cars. And then, then we need to see who can deliver these new solutions.
Well, enough, they seem to be able to, if they want to, make these political decisions more dramatically than
and faster, yeah.
And,
All our countries. So I talk for the U.S., my second, adopted country, and Germany, my first country. I think we are just it takes us too long to take decisions. And emerging economies, which are much more used to disruption and disruptive policies, they can take those.
if they choose to. Right.
Yeah, look at India and the currency, devaluation of taking the rupees out.
They start in 10 years, they're going to have all electric cars. Is that right? Something like
Yeah.
that.
We're going to finish.
So, okay.
We're going to finish now,
Interesting discussion.
and we can continue the discussion for the people online. Thank you, Charlotte, and thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you.
And we're going to have these the slides and the recording upload to the CMS website. So we'll send more information. Thank you, and thank you everyone who joined on the phone.
Thank you.